31 engineers had failed to fix Meridian Aviation's abandoned $38 million jet over 3 years. Then a night shift mechanic named Mason Cole did it in 8 hours and got fired for it before sunrise. Teterboro, New Jersey, Hangar 4, Meridian Aviation, Tuesday, 2:16 a.m. The Gulf Stream had sat grounded for 3 years, passed between 31 engineers across 2 continents, none of whom could explain why its secondary hydraulic feed kept losing pressure at altitude. A buyer in Geneva was finally ready to close. The penalty clause on the contract was $4.1 million if the jet didn't fly within 72 hours. Mason Cole was not one of the 31 engineers. His title was Ground Maintenance Technician, Night Rotation. His pay was $21.50 an hour. He had a 6-year-old daughter, Grace, asleep at a sitter's apartment 11 miles away, and an access badge that let him into hangars he had no clearance to touch. He walked into Hangar 4 at 2:16 a.m. He didn't call anyone. He didn't open a manual. He knelt by the hydraulic housing and pulled a seal ring the size of a coin out of his jacket pocket, a part that didn't exist in Meridian's parts catalog because he was the one who would put it there 10 years before anyone in that hangar knew his name. By 6:47 a.m., the jet's hydraulic pressure held steady through a full ground test. It had never held that steady in 3 years. At 9 a.m., CEO Diane Whitfield called him into her office and fired him for unauthorized interference with a client aircraft. She had no idea Mason Cole had engineered that jet's entire hydraulic platform a decade earlier, the same platform still flying under 61 tail numbers across Meridian's fleet. The Geneva buyer's jet was still leaving in 72 hours, and the man who built the fleet had just been walked out the front gate. Before we go back to the beginning, hit subscribe now because you will not want to miss how this story unfolds. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and how your day has been. Stories like this one remind us that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding everything together. Stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. Mason Cole's apartment sat above a laundromat in Hackensack, New Jersey, 14 minutes from Teterboro in car if the light on Route 17 cooperated. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, rent of $1,650 a month. The living room held a couch, a bookshelf of maintenance manuals, and no photographs except one, turned face down in the bottom drawer of his dresser, of a woman named Sarah who died 7 years ago on the Garden State Parkway in a crash that took 40 minutes for anyone to find. Grace was 6. She woke at 6:15 every morning without an alarm, the same way she had since she was 3, and she ate the same breakfast every day. 1 scrambled egg, dry toast, orange juice in a plastic cup with a chip on the rim that Mason had never replaced because Grace said it was the cup's one gray hair and refused to let him throw it away. "Are you coming home early today?" she asked most mornings, and most mornings Mason said the same thing, "I'll try." Not a promise. He had learned, the hard way, what happens to promises made by people who do not control their schedules. He drove her to Mrs. Alvarez's apartment at 7 a.m., 3 blocks from their building, and paid Mrs. Alvarez $180 a week in cash, folded twice, handed over without counting because both of them already knew the number. Then he drove to Teterboro and clocked in at 7:45 for a shift that officially ended at 4 p.m. and unofficially ended whenever the aircraft on the schedule stopped needing him. He had worked at Meridian for 2 years and 11 months. In that time, he had never called out sick. He had never asked for a raise. He had never mentioned to anyone that he held a degree in aerospace structural engineering from a program he'd left in his final semester, or that he had once held a title with his name printed under it in gold-embossed letters. The men on the floor called him the quiet one, or more often, nothing, because a man who does not talk about himself gives people very little to call him.
Grant Ferris, the chief operating officer, had approved Mason's hiring 3 years earlier without reading past the second page of his file. He had seen a gap in the employment history, a name that didn't match anything in Meridian's records, and a reference number that led to a maintenance shop in Ohio that had closed in 2019. He had stamped it approved anyway. Nobody asked him why. Nobody knew yet that Grant Ferris had a reason. Mason kept 2 mugs in his kitchen cabinet, not 4, because visitors were rare and he preferred it that way. He kept exactly 1 drawing pinned near the supply closet, folded into quarters, the lines on it too fine and too deliberate to be anything casual. If Grace ever asked what it was, he told her it was an old picture of a plane he used to like. She never asked twice. 6-year-olds rarely question an answer that sounds finished. At night, after Grace was asleep, Mason sat at the kitchen table and read technical bulletins from the FAA database, cross-referencing tail numbers against maintenance logs he was not authorized to access but had somehow retained login credentials for since a system migration in 2019 had never fully revoked them. He was looking for something. He had been looking for 3 months, ever since a memo crossed his desk about a Gulf Stream in Hangar 4 that Meridian was quietly trying to unload before its history became a liability. He recognized the tail number before he read the memo twice. He had assigned it himself a decade earlier on the day the aircraft rolled out of final assembly. The memo said the buyer in Geneva had walked twice already. Both times, the reason listed was the same: intermittent hydraulic warning during pre-purchase inspection, cause undetermined. He read that line 3 times on a Thursday night, standing in the break room with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, and something in his chest went very still. He had heard the aircraft before he ever saw the memo. 2 weeks earlier, walking past Hangar 4 on his way to a scheduled tow, he'd heard the auxiliary pump cycle twice in 4 seconds, a rhythm that didn't belong to any fault pattern currently logged in Meridian's system. He'd stopped walking. Nobody else on the ramp had noticed. The tow crew kept moving. A line technician named Dale Ruiz walked past the open hangar door without slowing down, headphones in, checklist in hand. Mason mentioned it once, carefully, to the shift supervisor, a woman named Patricia Nunez, who had been at Meridian for 11 years. The pump on the Gulf Stream in 4, its cycling short, might be worth a look before the next inspection. Patricia glanced at the work order clipped to her board. That aircraft's got a full engineering team on it. 3 of them, actually, flew in from Savannah last month. She said it kindly, not dismissively, the way people speak to someone they respect but don't yet understand the shape of. Mason nodded and let it go. He did not raise it again for 11 days. He watched instead. He walked past Hangar 4 at the start and end of every shift, and each time he listened the way he listened to everything, without appearing to listen at all. On the 9th day, the pump cycled 3 times in 4 seconds. On the 11th day, it cycled 4 times, and one of the senior engineers, a man named Robert Kessler, flown up from the Savannah team, told a Meridian executive on a phone call loud enough for the hallway to hear that they were close to a breakthrough. Mason knew they weren't. He knew because he'd built the system it was breaking in. Robert Kessler held a doctorate in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech and had spent 19 years certifying hydraulic systems for 3 different manufacturers. He stood in Hangar 4 on the 12th day with 2 other engineers, a laptop showing pressure curves that looked to everyone in the room entirely normal. "The redundancy check is clean," Kessler said. "Primary feed clean, secondary feed clean. If there's a fault, it's intermittent to the point of being unmeasurable, which means it might not be a fault at all. It might be a sensor calibration issue." Grant Ferris, standing at the edge of the hangar with his arms folded, asked the question that mattered most to him: "Can we deliver Friday?" "If it's the sensor, yes," Kessler said. "We recalibrate, we run 1 more static test, and it ships." Nobody in that hangar knew that the sensor had been recalibrated twice already, once by Kessler's own team 6 days ago, and the fault had returned within 48 hours both times. The data on the laptop looked clean because the failure only presented itself under a specific thermal load, a condition that only occurred after 90 minutes of continuous auxiliary pump operation, a threshold none of the ground tests had run long enough to reach. Mason knew this because he had built the thermal tolerance into the original housing specification a decade earlier, and he knew the housing had been quietly redesigned twice since then by engineers who never saw his original drawings, only a simplified version filed after his departure. He said nothing in the hangar. He was not asked, and men in gray coveralls with tool belts were generally not invited into conversations involving doctorates and pressure curves. He stood near the tow bar, coiling a cable that did not need coiling, and listened to Kessler explain with total confidence a theory that was wrong. Patricia caught his eye once, briefly, across the hangar. She didn't say anything, neither did he, but something passed between them, the particular tension of two people who sense a gap between what is being said and what is true, and neither one yet has the standing to close it. The recalibration happened Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the fault was back. Kessler's team ran the numbers again, adjusted the sensor threshold, and declared the aircraft ready for a final static test Thursday at noon, 72 hours before the Geneva buyer's plane was scheduled to depart. Mason spent his lunch break that Wednesday in the corner of the break room with a legal pad, not eating. He wrote down the timestamps he remembered from the pump cycles he had overheard, going back 11 days, and beside each an estimate of elapsed pump run time. He was not guessing. He had built this system. He knew what 90 minutes of continuous cycling did to the seal housing at altitude equivalent pressure because he had written the tolerance specification himself and had once watched an early prototype fail in exactly this pattern during a test flight over Georgia in 2016 before anyone thought to look at thermal load instead of mechanical wear. The pattern on his legal pad matched. Every fault had occurred within a narrow window, 92 to 98 minutes after the pump activated. Every recalibration had reset the clock, which is why the fault always seemed to disappear right after a fix and return 2 days later. Kessler's team was chasing a symptom, the seal ring itself, the one that Mason had specified for the tertiary line and never formally filed because the engineering department had reorganized twice before he could submit the documentation, was the actual point of failure. He looked up the part number in Meridian's current catalog. It wasn't there. It had never been there. The simplified drawing set that replaced his original design, the one that every engineer since had trained on, didn't include the tertiary line at all, because whoever filed the replacement drawings a decade ago had removed it without understanding what it did. Thursday's static test would run for 2 hours. If the aircraft held pressure past the 90-minute mark under full thermal load in front of Meridian's leadership and a representative from Geneva, it would fail publicly in the worst possible way, with 31 engineers standing there unable to explain why.
Thursday's static test began at noon with 6 people in Hangar 4. Kessler, 2 junior engineers, Patricia, Grant Ferris, and a representative from the Geneva buyers team named Elise Bonnard, flown in the night before at Meridian's expense. Mason was not scheduled to be there. He came anyway, on his own time, standing near the hangar's side entrance where ground crew were permitted to observe. Nobody asked him to leave. At the 88-minute mark, the pressure gauge on Kessler's laptop held steady. At 91 minutes, it dipped. At 94 minutes, an alarm sounded, and the readout showed a pressure drop in the tertiary feed line, a line that did not appear on any diagram in Kessler's possession. "That's not possible," Kessler said, twice, to no one in particular. Elise Bonnard checked her watch. Grant Ferris did not look at the aircraft. He looked at Mason, standing by the side entrance, and something in his face shifted, fast and controlled. the look of a man recalculating a plan that had just gone wrong in a very specific way. Patricia spoke first. "Mason flagged a short cycle pattern on this pump 2 weeks ago. I have the date if anyone wants it." Kessler turned. "Flagged it to whom?" "To me," Patricia said. "I didn't escalate it. That's on me, not him." Grant Farris crossed the hangar floor toward Mason with the particular walk of an executive trying to look unhurried. "You have something to say? Say it now." Mason didn't reach for a legal pad or a laptop. He walked to the housing himself, knelt beside it, and pointed to a line running behind the primary feed, nearly invisible unless a person already knew to look for it. "There's a tertiary seal ring in this housing. It's not in your current parts catalog. It fails after 90+ minutes under thermal load because the redesign 8 years ago dropped the tolerance spec for it." "How would you know that," he said slowly, "unless you'd seen the original design?" The hangar went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a question has an answer nobody's ready for. Mason didn't answer it yet. He asked instead if there was a spare seal ring in Meridian's inventory matching a part number he recited from memory, 6 digits, a number that hadn't been ordered by the company in years because nobody currently on staff knew it existed. Patricia checked. There was one, sitting in a bin marked MISC/unknown, unused since before she'd started at Meridian 11 years earlier. Grant Farris authorized the repair on the spot, mostly because Elise Bonnard was standing 3 feet away with her arms crossed and a flight to catch, and refusing to allow a possible fix proceed would have looked worse than allowing an unauthorized mechanic near a $38 million aircraft. Mason worked for 6 hours. He replaced the seal ring, adjusted the housing tolerance by hand using a torque spec he did not need to look up, and ran the static test again from 0. At the 90-minute mark, the pressure held. At the 120-minute mark, the test ended with the readout flat and steady, the cleanest result the aircraft had produced in 3 years. Elise Bonnard signed the acceptance paperwork that evening. The penalty clause was void. The $4.1 million risk Meridian had been carrying for 11 days disappeared with a signature. Grant Farris should have been relieved. He was not. He spent that night going through Meridian's archived personnel files, cross-referencing a name he hadn't allowed himself to think about in 10 years, and found what he already suspected he'd find. A design credit buried in a decade-old engineering database for the fleet's entire hydraulic platform, attributed to a young engineer named Mason Cole, who left the company abruptly in 2016 and whose original drawings were quietly replaced, simplified, and refiled under a departmental credit instead of his name. Grant Farris had signed off on that refiling himself. He was the one person at Meridian who knew the entire time exactly who had walked back through the front gate 3 years ago wearing a maintenance uniform. Grant Farris did not go to CEO Diane Whitfield that night. He went the following morning before she'd finished her coffee and told her only part of what he knew. An unauthorized technician had entered a restricted hangar without clearance, bypassed safety protocol, and performed an unsupervised repair on a client aircraft worth $38 million. He did not mention that the repair had worked. He did not mention the name Mason Cole meant anything beyond a badge number. Diane fired Mason at 9 a.m., the same morning the ink was drying on Elise Bonnard's acceptance paperwork. Mason didn't argue. He asked one question before he left her office. "Before that jet flies to Geneva, has anyone pulled the original design drawings, not the current ones, the originals?" Diane didn't understand the question. She signed the termination form anyway. She understood it 4 days later, standing in Meridian's records archive, a room she hadn't visited since her father built the company from 2 hangars and a loan he never fully paid off before he died. She found a flat file drawer registered under Grant Ferris's old department, and inside an engineering credit history that had been altered in 2016, the same year Mason Cole's name disappeared from Meridian's payroll and reappeared 3 years later on a maintenance schedule under a job title that gave him no authority over anything he had built. She called Patricia into her office first, not Grant. Patricia told her about the pump cycle Mason had flagged 2 weeks before anyone else noticed, and about the 11 years she'd spent at Meridian watching engineers rotate through hangars while one quiet man kept the fleet's actual foundation memorized in his head, with no credit attached to any of it. She called a full engineering review that Friday. She invited Kessler, she invited the Geneva buyer's technical liaison, who was still in the country, and asked unprompted to attend. And she invited Mason Cole, not as a guest, but as the presenter, because by then she had read the original 2016 design set herself and understood that the man Grant Ferris had walked out the front gate 11 days ago held the only complete technical record of Meridian's entire hydraulic platform. Mason stood in front of 31 engineers, some of whom had spent 3 years failing to solve a problem he had already solved once a decade earlier, before any of them had joined the company. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't mention the firing. He opened the original drawings, pointed to the tertiary line, and explained in plain terms what had been missing from their training for 10 years and why. The review lasted 3 hours. Nobody left early. Kessler asked most of the questions, and by the end, he asked them without any defensiveness left in his voice, the way a person asks when they've stopped protecting their own reputation and started actually trying to learn something. He shook Mason's hand afterwards and said the housing redesign in 2016 should never have gone forward without someone checking the original tolerance spec first, and that the mistake wasn't Mason's to carry, it was the department's, going back a decade. Diane Whitfield didn't hold a press conference. She didn't put out a statement crediting Mason Cole publicly because when she offered to in a private meeting 2 days later, she said he didn't want that, and she believed him enough not to push it. What she did instead was quieter and, in its way, more permanent. She reinstated him, not to his old maintenance position, but to Chief Design Engineer, the title that had been sitting useless in Meridian's org chart since 2016 because nobody had ever formally closed it out. She backdated his engineering credit on every aircraft in the fleet built from his original platform, 61 tail numbers, so that the paperwork finally matched what had always been true. Grant Ferris resigned before she had to ask him to. The conversation between them lasted 4 minutes. He didn't deny what he'd done. He said at the end of it that he'd convinced himself over the years that removing Mason's name from the record was a formality, a cleanup task, nothing that mattered once the man himself was gone. Diane didn't argue with him. She just told him the aircraft in Hangar 4 had nearly failed publicly in front of a client because of exactly that kind of convenient forgetting. Mason came home that evening at 5:30, early enough that Grace was still awake and building something out of cardboard at the kitchen table. She asked if he was still fixing the plane. He told her the plane was already fixed and that he'd be working on planes for a long time now at a different desk. She asked if the new desk had a window. He said it did. She said that was good because planes need windows to be watched properly. He sat with her while she finished her cardboard project, an airplane, lopsided and taped together with more tape than the design required, and he didn't correct her tolerances or her angles. He let it be exactly what it was. Later, after she was asleep, he opened the drawer under the flashlight batteries, took out the old company card with his title printed under his name, and this time he didn't put it back. The most valuable people in any building are often the ones nobody thinks to ask a question. They don't announce what they know. They don't wait for credit before they do the work right. Mason Cole never asked Meridian to remember his name. He only asked that the aircraft be safe and that the people flying it come home. If this story moved you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments about someone in your life who was underestimated until the moment they couldn't be anymore. We read every one of them.